home alone, then we homeschooled them at home because I worked all day, so they were home alone. Yes, it's been 10 years since then, and yes, the stories have continued to come out. I'm glad I didn't know at the time some of the things that went on, but at the end of the day, everybody survived and went on to live a very happy life. But it's different to homeschool when it is your choice versus when it is thrust upon you.
Yes,
for sure. And just I've opened up the webinar because we hit that mark. So I'm just going to give people a few seconds here to get their audio dialed in, and then we'll get rolling.
Great.
I see a pretty good critical mass of people, so we'll make sure that we type this in for anybody that comes in a little bit later. But welcome to today's webinar. Time is of the essence, so I won't go into too much detail, but if you're not familiar, this is Zoom webinar. So your cameras and your microphones are disabled by default on this call. So if you want to interact with Diane or any of the other officials from the Department of Education or with AACRAO, you'll have to use the chat function or the Q&A function. For any question, given the size of this call, we're going to really want you to steer those into that Q&A because it makes it much easier for us to get to all of them in a timely manner. But if you just have general comments or discussion, the chat is the best place for that. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Mike Riley.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everybody to our webinar today. Topic today is what institutions need to know about the new distance learning regulations. And we're very pleased. We could not have had a better source to join us to discuss these than colleagues from the Department of Education, led by the Honorable Diane Jones, the Principal Deputy Undersecretary, who's delegated the duties of the Undersecretary. Diane, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to my team for joining me. So Michael Brickman, Dave Musser, and Greg Martin are also with me. So when you have a question that's a hard one, I will, of course, turn it over to them, the people who are much better at answering the hard questions. So thanks so much for having us.
That's great. And AACRAO colleagues will remember Diane joined us, I guess it was March or April of 2019, came in virtually to our annual meeting in Los Angeles, actually during the period when these negotiated rulemaking sessions were going on. And I will note that as part of the team, Tina Faulkner from the University of Minnesota, who at the time was also the AACRAO president, served as an alternate on the negotiated rulemaking team, so representing public four-year institutions. So AACRAO has been pretty engaged with this for some time. So talking today, of course, about the negotiated rulemaking, the department published the new version of its rules that take place in 2021, but have indicated to institutions that these new flexibilities can begin as soon as possible. And we'll hear a lot of detail about what took place. And Diane, you're going to have a little presentation that you've put together. And then we've also set up some questions in advance that we thought might resonate with AACRAO members. But I will say, I don't know that I've seen a broader range of topics under one negotiated rulemaking umbrella as this. And congratulate you for reaching consensus on it, which is certainly no easy task. And before you start with your presentation, can you just talk a little bit about how you organize the work?
You mean organizing the work of rulemaking?
Yeah, for this particular one, since you had things from faith-based institutions to distance ed to.
Right. Well, we did. We had an ambitious agenda, and we had lots and lots of topics. Some of which don't really seem to go together, but I think that's just a byproduct of when you have to do negotiated rulemaking, you tend to get these laundry lists of things that build up so that when you have rulemaking, you can move on them. Because we knew that we had so many topics, and frankly, we were criticized for having so many different topics, but we think the results proved that we had a really good plan for engaging the use of subcommittees so that we could have experts in particular areas focus on main topics, and then they could make recommendations to the main panel so that we could cover such a broad range of topics. And by doing that, we brought probably an additional 30, maybe even more negotiators to the table so that we really could have tables of subject matter experts on each one of these issues. And in the end, then we divided them up. The first reg was accreditation and state authorization. The second one was teach grants and regulations regarding faith-based institutions. And then this third one for distance education and innovation.
That's great. So Mike, why don't you go ahead and set up the presentation that Diane will lead us through.
Great, and I'm just gonna, for those of you who are dialing in, because I can't speak and do technology at the same time, Mike is gonna advance the slides for me, so I'll just let him know. Some of these slides I'm gonna go through quickly. If you want to come back to them, we can, but I'm going to try to focus on the things that I think would be of greatest interest to all of you. So it's just our agenda. We can just move to the next slide. So, you know, we did our notice of proposed rulemaking in 2020. We published our final rules on September 2nd, 2020. And as Mike already said, these are effective technically on July 1, 2021, but the Secretary enabled voluntary early implementation. So any institution that chooses to implement these regs immediately, they are able to do so. Next slide. So we were trying to, when I say current regulations, it means the ones that are technically in place, even though we know that some of you are using the new regulations as your current regulations. So, you know, the nomenclature is a little confusing at first, but in the current regulations, there was no definition of academic engagement. And frankly, what we heard from the community is that schools were feeling like they had to create a lot of busy work activities to check the box. In other words, they had to have students post a blog every 2 days or engage in a chat just to check the box for the Department of Education. And that seemed to us to sort of defeat the whole purpose of innovation that suggests people can learn in different ways and on different time frames. It was also very difficult. I mean, one of the reasons that adult learners like distance learning is it gives them more flexibility to work around their family schedules and their work schedules. But having them, you know, have to sign in every 2 days to post a blog, especially for those members of the military who may have been posted abroad and couldn't sign in every 2 days, it just seemed like that was a busy work requirement that wasn't really adding to the instructional experience. And so we found it to be necessary to define academic engagement, to give people a clear sense of what they had to do to prove that students were engaged, but to have that definition be broad enough that schools were not creating busy work assignments just because of the department. Next slide. The reason that academic engagement is important is because it applies to the return to Title IV calculations. So there are, and frankly, there were schools that had a negative program review findings some years ago because it was determined that they did not have sufficient evidence that students were engaged. So we found it was necessary to clearly define that, to make it clear that it has to involve more than logging into a class. You can't just log in and walk away. But we wanted a broad set of activities that would be required to demonstrate academic engagement. And you'll see, we'll get to this later, we wanted to also make it clear that an institution can't force a student to engage in every activity. So we really focus on opportunities for engagement more than check marks about was the student there for every single chat. Next slide. We also looked at definitions, credit hour and clock hour. And one of the big differences you'll see in the distance learning regulation is that in the past, distance learning was not permissible for clock hour programs. As the negotiators discussed this, it became clear that there was asynchronous distance learning permitted by a number of the licensing boards that are associated with clock hour programs. So we did reach consensus that allowed us to add asynchronous learning. And then in the course of doing the negotiate, reading the public comments, the timing was perfect for the NPRM. It turns out that while we were in the process of finalizing this regulation, the COVID pandemic started, And all of a sudden, licensing bodies were starting to permit asynchronous distance learning for certain portions of programs that lead to professional licensure. A comment came in saying, hey, the world has changed. Do you want to recognize it? And we said, what a great idea. Perfect timing. So you'll see in the final rule, we do include both synchronous and asynchronous for clock hour programs. But made it clear that because it is a clock hour, there has to be a way to monitor a student's participation. And we were told over and over again during rulemaking that the technology to do that is actually quite advanced and quite easy. And in fact, many employers, including certain agencies of the federal government, have employed that software during COVID to monitor people's workday. So, so fortunately, the timing on this, we were disappointed that it took us so long to get this rule finalized, but in the end, it might have been very fortuitous because it allowed us to go one step further. Next slide. We had heard going into rulemaking, going back to, I guess, was it 2016, the program integrity rules that created the definition of a credit hour, tying it to the Carnegie unit. I'm seeing in the chat, will the slides be available? Yeah, we're happy to make the slides available. These are the same slides that will be used at the FSA conference, so they'll be available there, but we can make these slides available to you and your members. So, we had heard concern about the credit hour definition that was linked to the Carnegie unit. And we understood that for distance learning and competency-based learning, the seat time definition just didn't work. On the other hand, when we got into negotiations, there seemed to be concern about completely abandoning that because A, there needed to be some quality assurance mechanism, and negotiators felt that it was important to have some common basis so that students who were transferring from one institution to another, that there was sort of a common language of what a credit means. So in our new definition, we still refer to the Carnegie unit as, you don't have to show seat time to demonstrate the credit hour. You can be measuring an amount of learning, but that amount of learning should equate to what is sort of commonly understood. And I know commonly understood is vague, but I was a professor for 10 years, right? We all kind of know what that means. And so basically what we've said is it's an amount of work equivalent to 1 hour of classroom or direct faculty instruction and 2 hours of out of class work. Now we've all seen the studies. We know that most students don't actually do the 2 hours of out of school work. But they should. So we're just gonna, trudge forward. Now, I think the one place where we're trying to encourage institutions to think differently about the credit hour is, since the beginning of time, we've always kind of understood that a credit hour is 1 hour of class time and 2 hours of homework time, except when it comes to lab classes. Right? We all know that the 4-hour lab class, well, the 3 hours of instruction are treated like a regular class, but the 1 hour of credit for the lab is usually 1 credit for a 3-hour lab. And lab classes are the one place where you do have homework, and it's more than 2 hours for every hour in class. And so what we've said in our reg is, when we mean consistent, we mean consistent. And we might need to dispel this old-fashioned notion, which was really based on the concept that it was less work for the faculty member to prepare for a lab, and frankly, it was usually outsourced to a grad student. So we're asking institutions to be thoughtful about this and to not just continue, because it's always been this way, to really give students insufficient credit for the amount of work that's done in a lab course. This is important because I think one of the reasons why we see a fairly significant dropout rate among STEM majors is if you have a STEM major and a non-STEM major, and they're both enrolled in 15 credit hours, but the STEM major has, 3-4 credit lab classes and then a 3-credit lecture class. Well, the non-STEM student is in class for 15 hours a week, but the STEM student is probably in class for closer to 21 hours a week. And they have real homework associated with those labs. And so you can understand why those students drop out at a higher rate or move to another major if they have to work, or if they're an athlete, we have added more time to their class schedule, which may make it difficult to do these other things. So in our regs, we've highlighted this, we've flagged this in saying, that old-fashioned way of assigning credit needs to be examined. Now, we haven't come out so strong as to tell schools how to evaluate lab courses, but we do think it's time to give students credit for all of the work they do, and especially now that labs and internships are such an important part of the learning experience. Next slide. We've made clear some definitions. I think there was some lack of clarity about what's the difference between a correspondence course and distance learning, and we've made it very clear that in a correspondence course, the student decides when to interact with the faculty member. So but at the same time, we've expanded the definition of instructor to make it clear that an instructor need not be the old-fashioned one professor at the front of the classroom or in front of the Zoom camera, which is not so old-fashioned, but we've changed the definition to say instructors. We understand that there are new models of education that involve instructional teams. And so we defer to the accreditor to determine what credentials are required of individuals on that instructional team. And so we allow the interaction to be with instructors. The other thing is we have changed the way we look at determining whether a student is a correspondence student or not. And what we've said is for a student to be considered a correspondence student, they have to be enrolled in correspondence courses for more than 50% of their enrollment. So more than 50% of their courses in which they're enrolled would need to be correspondence in order for that student to be categorized as a correspondence student. This creates a little more flexibility for new models that allow students to, patch together different kinds of learning experiences because, clearly different courses may have a different format. Next slide. So here's what we did to try to hold ourselves accountable. We are aware of recertifications that would be pending for years, sometimes because there wasn't enough time to process them, and sometimes potentially for strategic purposes. And we've said that's not fair. So our new regulations require the department to process a recertification application within 12 months. If the department doesn't get around to it in 12 months, then the school is given is recertified. We have 12 months to do our work, and if we can't do it, the school is then certified. Now, the department retains the ability to issue provisional certifications, but not just as a default setting, right? So it is possible that you could still be issued a provisional certification, but we can't just say, oh, we didn't get to it, therefore you're provisionally certified. I mean, there's got to be a reason. So we're trying to hold ourselves accountable. As you might imagine, this puts some pressure on the department, but we felt as though, you have to meet your timelines, and it was good for us to start imposing some timelines on ourselves. Next slide. Again, we've already talked about the definition of instructors rather than the instructor. We've decided that probably there aren't too many people that learn through DVDs or CD-ROMs anymore. So we've tried to update the language, obviously, without changing the intent of the statute. We define the instructor as the individual responsible for delivering the course content who meets the qualifications established by the accrediting agency. So again, it could be one person, it could be a team of people. And we understand that qualifications for somebody teaching auto mechanics may look very different from somebody who's teaching doctoral students in philosophy. We think accreditors understand those differences and will hold schools accountable. And so we defer to the institution for what meets the qualification for an instructor or a member of an instructional team. Next slide. We've defined substantive interaction, and again, we've tried to be broad. Substantive interaction can involve direct instruction. It can involve assessing a student's work and providing feedback. It can involve answering questions or providing some tutoring. It can involve facilitating a group discussion. Any instructional activity in which the student is engaged would be considered substantive interaction. And again, we've tried to make it broad enough that it covers different kinds of learning, and yet not so broad that people could, literally just log in and be considered to be substantively engaged. That would not be appropriate. Next slide. And substantive and regular go together. Actually, regular and substantive go together. Regular, I think, is why we saw schools assigning the, every other day blog post. We've said that regular interaction must be predictable. So a student must have the opportunity to participate on a scheduled basis. But we have not defined the schedule. And we know that not every student is going to engage in every activity. And so it's no longer the check the box, did the student post the blog? It's, is there meaningful opportunity for learning? Is the student, does the student have an opportunity to engage? And in the distance environment, maybe even more importantly, are the instructors monitoring the students' engagement and success? We know that there are new technologies that allow instructors to evaluate a student's work every 3 or 4 minutes, right? We know that adaptive learning software gives lots and lots of feedback. So engaging, so a faculty member may be spending a lot of time monitoring data to figure out how to reach individually to each student in the best way. And so that's a different kind of interaction, but one that is incredibly important and maybe more efficient and more effective than a traditional lecture environment. So we wanted to make sure that we were flexible in how we defined that engagement. And we've made it clear that where there are technology assisted engagements like adaptive learning, this is one of the ways that you can document engagement, because an adaptive learning software typically records information about the student's interaction. Next slide. We gave clarification. There seemed to be a lot of confusion about what constitutes an incarcerated student. And we just clarified that, individuals in juvenile justice facilities and other similar facilities, they would be eligible for Pell Grants. They would not be considered to be incarcerated in a federal or state penal institution. That was one of those things that probably didn't fit exactly in with distance learning, but you couldn't do a whole rulemaking just on that topic, so we kind of slid it in here. Next slide. For direct assessment programs, the department's role in evaluating direct assessment programs is really limited to, do you have the capacity to disperse Title IV in a direct assessment program? We never did, we never will, we don't have the authority to do the quality check. And so it seemed silly to us that we had a school come back every time they had a new direct assessment. I mean, if you have figured out how to disperse aid for one, we're pretty sure you can apply it to other courses and programs. So these regs require a school to get approval from the department for the first direct assessment program at a particular credential level. And then any others after that at the same credential level, obviously the accreditor will do the quality check, but you do not need to come back to the department for approval from the department. So we think that we think this gives more flexibility, and for those schools that are doing a good job with direct assessment, it allows them to keep pace with change, which is something that the department isn't so good at. I mean, we are constrained by any number of things. So instead of getting approval for those additional programs, you have to report them to the department within 10 days. Next slide. There are some flexibilities that are provided in this regulation. So the first one permits preparatory coursework required by a state for teacher certification to be offered using direct assessment. We think this could make huge changes in the ability for professionals in various fields, and in particular in STEM fields, to get the credentials they need to teach. I've been at this for a long time, and over and over in my career, we've worked on, trying to find ways that people who are practicing scientists who want to be K-12 teachers can make that transition. And it's always been difficult. Well, direct assessment may be one of those ways that we can help people in other occupations who want to be teachers, gain the necessary preparatory coursework to be certified. For the first time, if you go back, we are allowing programs to be offered in part through credit hour and in part through clock hour. So we're now allowing combinations. And we are requiring an institution to establish methodologies to reasonably equate each module in a direct assessment program to either credit hours or clock hours. Again, it's not a seat time, but it's, an amount of learning or a number of learning objectives are expected to be considered in that equivalency. Next slide. Charges on a subscription basis. Now I'm going to be honest and tell you that when it comes to subscription programs, I am not the expert, but my team members on the phone are. So I'm going to quickly go through these slides, but if you have questions, we can get to them at the end. And Dave and Greg, who have deep expertise in this, can jump in. I'm not going to go too deep into these because I will probably get them wrong, but we have created more flexibilities in subscription programs to allow, for example, students to have a one-time opportunity to make up work. We've tried to make it more clear how Title IV can be dispersed through a subscription program. And I think we've tried to streamline some of our regulations so that it's not so confusing for schools that want to move to a subscription-based program. Next slides. Next slide. This talks about the eligibility for subsequent disbursements. And so I don't, again, this is not my area of expertise. But we understand that in a subscription-based program, students may shift work to different times based on their personal life or their personal schedule. It may be that there are some overlapping activities. They may be into the next term, so to speak, but there are still some activities they're finishing up in a prior term. So we've created some changes to the regulations about student eligibility, the number of credit hours, and how to disperse aid. And again, if you have questions about the specifics during Q&A, I'll turn to Greg and Dave to dive into the details. Next slide. The rationale for these changes is that, we think competency-based education is very promising. We've seen some institutions use it very effectively, in particular with adult learners. And so we wanted to, of course, maintain high quality CBE, but we wanted to lower some of the barriers. And frankly, we heard from schools that they were afraid to adopt CBE and to disperse Title IV based on CBE because they weren't quite sure where we were going to come out, and they couldn't afford to take that chance and then, have us come back and say, no, you owe us money back. And we also understand that because students in a competency-based education program may be juggling lots of other life issues, that we didn't want to impose these artificial delays into a student's progress just because we had bureaucratic rules in place. So we've tried to be more flexible and give institutions guidance about how to work with students as they navigate through a competency-based education program. Next slide. The subscription-based disbursement method requires a student to complete a certain number of competencies in the past subscription period in order to receive Title IV funds in a subsequent subscription period. So we don't require the completion of specific competencies in a subscription period, and it allows for coursework to overlap or even extend beyond a payment period. So we're trying to help schools determine how to disperse aid based on a predetermined number of competencies, but creating a little bit more flexibility in how those get sequenced and how you can disperse aid to a student, who may be further ahead in one course than another. Next slide. Let's go to the next one. I'm going to skip the rest of these subscription-based. When in Q&A, you can ask questions about those, which means that I've now told you everything I know about subscription-based programs, and I am not going to waste your time. We can, in Q&A, turn it over to the experts. We have some additional reporting requirements in the new reg. As I said before, after the first direct assessment program has been approved, subsequent programs at the same credential level can be added without our approval, but you do need to report them. We have also allowed for written arrangements, and we have changed substantive change requirements on the accreditation side so that when somebody's trying to negotiate a written arrangement, we now allow an accreditor to have policies in place that would allow the staff to evaluate and potentially approve a written arrangement. If it's a high stakes decision, they can they can certainly move it to the board, the accreditation decision-making body. But for low risk kinds of written agreements, things that the agency has seen over and over, it is no longer a substantive change. It's one that the staff can sign off on. And again, we just expect, so this is an increased reporting requirement. We've been asked, people want to know, well, how many of these are taking place? So now you don't need approval from us, but you do need to report to us when more than 25% of a program is being delivered through a written arrangement. And you must report on the application to participate no later than 10 days after the change occurs. So you have a 10-day period to report to us. Next slide. We've added some clarifications and flexibilities. We've heard for years about, the faculty governance model. And frankly, employers have complained about it, and so have presidents. There have been presidents that have been very interested in having programs that flex and bend more quickly to meet workforce demands and changes in technology. And sometimes faculty approval bodies are slow. And sometimes there are strategic kinds of activities that really impede progress. And so we've made it clear in our regulations that the traditional faculty governance model is a governance model, but it is not the or the only governance model. And so an institution can have policies in place that for workforce responsive programs allow them to more quickly implement changes if they're based on the recommendations of an advisory board or changes in licensure or certification exams. So we think that this gives the opportunity for administrators to make sure that their workforce responsive programs are keeping pace with change. Again, this doesn't apply to the philosophy program, but we think that employers we want employers to be engaged. And look, I've been in higher ed long enough to know that getting universities and employers to the table and for a long-term relationship is not easy. And each complains about the other. And so basically what we've said is we need this partnership to be better. And so therefore we need to give schools the ability to be more responsive to their advisory boards, or the advisory boards stop showing up because they feel like whatever they say doesn't matter. So this is one flexibility. We have created, a calculation that you can use to determine what percentage of a program can be offered by an ineligible entity. We didn't exceed the 50%. That's still the limit, but we've changed the ease with which you can have a written arrangement approved and implemented at up to the 50% level. And we've made clear that written arrangements do not apply to internship or externship portions of a program. Next slide. We have looked at the conversion formula. So whether and this mostly refers to clock hour to credit hour conversions. And we've clarified that outside hours, while they are included in the credit hour definition, if you are converting a credit hour program back to clock hours, the homework time is generally not included. Most licensing boards don't include homework time. And so therefore, when you are a program that's subject to the 150% rule, meaning that the program can't be longer than 150% of the licensure requirement, this became a problem because as credit hour programs were converted back to clock hours, if homework was included, you found schools and programs that now exceeded the 150% rule, but they didn't really because the licensing board wouldn't count the homework hours. And so we've made it clear that homework is not considered in the conversion. We just don't know of any licensing boards that are willing to consider homework time in a clock hour determination. Next slide. I preempted my next slide. So this is the reasonable relationship between program length and entry-level requirements. understanding that this doesn't apply to all programs, but for those that do fall under this requirement, the 150% rule stands, that a program can't be more than 150% of the requirement in a state to be licensed. But we understand that students go across state lines to work, to go to school, and that states can have different requirements. So the new regulation says that the program cannot be more than 150% of what is required to be licensed in the state in which the school is located, but also any adjoining state. So we're not quite covering the whole country yet, but we at least now have accommodated, those students who go back and forth between New York and New Jersey, or any other adjacent state. We know students go across state lines, and so we've made sure that a student can go across state lines and still get the number of clock hours they need to be qualified to work in either state. Next slide. We've provided more information about calculating satisfactory academic progress in subscription-based programs. We want to make sure that students are not going to keep receiving Title IV if they're not progressing, but we also wanted to give the flexibility for one catch-up period. We understand things happen in students' lives, they get deployed, COVID happens, they're now trying to homeschool children, and their life can be disrupted. And so there is now, a single catch-up period that allows a student to catch up on their work without losing Title IV eligibility. Next slide. For non-term credit hour and clock hour programs, the students are not able to receive a subsequent disbursement until 1/2 of the hours and weeks in the academic year are successfully completed. So there's no PACE calculation required in determining SAP, but they have to. But there is a requirement that the next disbursement cannot come until 1/2 of the hours of a total year are completed. Next slide. Maximum time frame. There's still a maximum time frame, that relates to, for example, Pell eligibility, program length, and undergraduate programs measured in credit hours have the option to express maximum time frames in calendar time. This is important for subscription-based programs, competency-based programs. There are oftentimes programs where it makes more sense for the school to say this is a certain calendar period that you can finish this program in this many months or this many years, as opposed to just numbers of credits or hours. Next slide. GPA requirements are unchanged. So the SAP calculation regarding GPA is unchanged. I'm sure that's important to all of you. So that has not changed. Next slide. This is the appeals process. I'm going to skip this. This is one. If you have questions, Dave or Greg can jump in. This is an area where I haven't spent a lot of time, so I don't want to talk about something that I know nothing about. So if you have questions, we can come back in the Q&A. Let's keep going. We'll go to the next slide. And then we have this question about students not considered to be withdrawn. So one of the things that we heard from the field is when you have a competency-based program or a direct assessment program, you could have a person that finishes their work very quickly. That maybe their work schedule is such that they have, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And so they get a lot of work done early. And in the past, the concern was that if they completed all of their work and it was, not at the end of the term, should they be considered to have been withdrawn? Well, that doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem right to penalize a student who's efficient and gets their work done quickly. So we've made it clear that a student who completes their requirements early, so to speak, is not considered to have withdrawn as long as they've completed their requirements. Next slide. And approved leaves of absences. We added subscription-based programs to the types of programs that do not require the institution oh, wait a minute. Let me, you know what? Dave or Greg, can you jump in? I'm not sure that I fully remember what we decided on leave of absence. Can you jump in on this one?
No problem, Diane. This is David Musser from FSA. And this provision is essentially treating subscription-based programs like we treat non-term programs. For non-term programs, and that includes both credit hour and clock hour programs, we allow schools to put a student on a leave of absence and then let the student return from that leave of absence without resuming the exact same coursework that the student had begun that the student was working on when they went on the leave in the first place. So because subscription-based programs are so similar to non-term programs, we adopted the same approach in this rulemaking, and we allowed students in subscription-based programs to go on a leave of absence and then return and take entirely new coursework if the school decided to do that.
Thanks, Dave. I know this is an issue important to your community, and so I did not want to get this one wrong. So thanks, Dave. Next slide. There's an order of return of funds, and I think that this is clearly laid out in the regulations. Next slide. There are new regulations about the number of days that a student is scheduled to attend. There are some regulations here about modules. And in the Q&A, again, this is a place where Michael and Dave and Greg are going to be able to give you much more information about the use of modules and attendance than I'm familiar with. So we can get back to that in the Q&A. Next slide. Written arrangements with eligible foreign institutions. One of the concerns that we heard is that there are students who decide to enroll at a foreign school. But if they came home for a summer break or a winter break and then decided to take classes here in the US, they were ineligible for student loans when they went back to the foreign school. And weren't we prescient way before COVID to realize that there could be reasons why a student enrolled in a foreign school might not be able to get back to the foreign school? So fortunately, what we were able to change in these regulations is the ability for a foreign institution to have a written arrangement either with another ineligible foreign institution or with an institution in the US, so that a portion of a student's program could be completed at an ineligible institution. And by the way, this could be outside of a written arrangement as well. Student just happens to come home and decides to take classes on their own. Again, they could do up to 25% of their program back in the US and not lose their eligibility for their loan when they go back to the foreign school. Next slide. And I just talked about this, so we can, and I just want to make clear on that slide, we did make sure that the 25%, that in addition, there was still time that a student could come back to the US for doctoral dissertation research. So we wanted to make sure that just taking classes didn't then make it impossible for them to do doctoral dissertation work potentially back in the US. Next slide. Final audit determinations and program reviews. Basically, this is us making it very clear that the department will defer to the accreditor. When it comes to determining whether or not a course was distance learning or correspondence course, whether the instructors met the definition for regular and substantive, that we would refer, and with questions regarding credit hour, that the department would defer to the policies of the accrediting agency. This is so closely linked to quality determinations that it really is best left with accrediting agencies and not the department, where we have a statutory prohibition on being the quality determinators. So we've handed this back to the accreditors. Next slide. I think that's it. So I know we went through quickly, and again, Dave and Greg and Michael are here to get more into the details. We'll go through the questions that are on these slides, and then we can open it up.
So Diane, I think you covered this, the credit hour conversation. Let's move to the next question. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we understand there were some changes on the part of the department on how they view the distinction between regional and national accreditors. So can you talk a little bit about that, and then any changes to how
Sure.
accreditors operate?
Sure. So what we determined over time is that the accreditors formerly known as regional accreditors, most of them had activities in many, many more states than the states that were in their original defined region. And so this was becoming confusing for students. And we would get calls from students saying, I'm attending a program in Rhode Island, but they say they're accredited by a California accreditor. How can that be? Are they lying to me? And so, especially with multi-campus systems, we found that almost all of the so-called regional accreditors were functioning across the country and in many foreign countries. At the same time, there was also this belief that, regional accreditors kind of owned their states, and there's nothing in statute or regs that limits the opportunity for somebody to be accredited to a single regional accreditor. And this was creating challenges, in students trying to figure out who accredits my school, but probably more problematic than that is, there were students that were having great difficulty transferring credits or enrolling in graduate education because the receiving institution would say, oh, well, we're not going to take any credits because that's from a nationally accredited institution. And in our mind, that was not fair to students or taxpayers when we hold regional and national accreditors to the same standards. And so there had been this artificial distinction created between regional and national accreditors, and that distinction is not based on our regs. So we have taken scope out or geography out of the scope for accreditors, and we've basically recognized that all accreditors function at the national level, and no accreditor owns a state. And already there's a school that would have otherwise been in HLC's region that is now being accredited by WASC. And that made sense because this is a nonprofit institution, but a multi-campus system, and their other campuses were accredited by WASC. So the idea here is that now when an accreditor has activity in a new state, they have to report it to the public and to us, right? They have to include on their website, oh, we have activity in Georgia now. And they have to report it to the department, but they don't have to come back for a change of scope. And so all accreditors are essentially national accreditors. Now, we don't require a formerly known as regional accreditor to be willing to accredit a new institution in another state. We're not forcing them, we're permitting it. And so we think some agencies will take this opportunity and others won't. But the main distinction here, or the main difference, is that schools can no longer hide behind this to deny credits or transfer or graduate education opportunities to students. Certainly a school can have policies to not accept transfer credits, but the schools, based on our accreditation regs, schools are required to be very clear about what they will and will not accept. And it can no longer be this blanket idea of we're not going to accept credits because you're accredited by a national accreditor. If there's a school that one institution believes is not high enough quality and they don't want to accept credits, fine, just say so on your website or other marketing materials. And we're aware that there are institutions that accept no transfer credits, and that's fine too. But the idea here is to make sure that students can look ahead and know whether or not in general their credits are going to transfer. The accreditation regulations also require institutions to explain to students why they are not accepting transfer credits when they are a school that says, oh, sure, we accept transfer credits. And that explanation has to be based, at least in part, on a review of the work the student performed. It cannot just be my faculty are smarter, my institution's better. You have to look at the work that the student did and make a reasonable determination about whether that work was reasonably equivalent to what the accepting institution provides. So again, we don't dictate policy, but we do think students have the right to a fair and impartial review, and these regs encourage that.
So there's a related question in the question box, if I may. Is there any plan to provide guidance to employers on the new understanding of regional and national? Our prospective students are finding their employers will not cover DAC accredited programs.
So that's really interesting. Well, so we heard that there were some challenges with states. So we sent a letter to every state, letting them know that if they have state licensure policies, for example, that limit licensure to regionally accredited institutions, that they were probably going to have to change their requirements, because if they pointed to us as the determinant of regional versus national, that was no longer possible. So we did send a letter to states of this type. But we haven't sent a letter to employers, and I'm not even quite sure how we would do that. However, we do have a pretty strong relationship with SHRM. And so maybe we can work with SHRM and through their network, get this message out to a larger, and so maybe if we work with the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, and SHRM, maybe we can work with those three organizations to get this message out. And if you have any suggestions for other organizations, please let me know. We're happy to share that. That's a great point.
Thank you. Bill, I'll go ahead and field these. One question, of course, this was very common during the pandemic and is still ongoing. Are there any limitations or issues or recommendations to changing grading scales to pass-fail because of the pandemic and sudden change to online learning? Our school has not offered distance ed prior to the current health crisis. So how does pass-fail impact any of the ED policies?
So I know that I know we've had conversations about pass-fail, and I can't remember where we landed. So I'm going to ask Michael, Greg, Dave, can you jump in? I know we've had these conversations about allowing schools to pivot to pass-fail during the pandemic, but I can't remember where we landed. Can you jump in?
Yeah, this is Greg. I'll handle that. Yeah, pass-fail. Well, we've always permitted pass-fail coursework. That's always been something institutions could do. With the pandemic, of course, many institutions have decided they want to do more of that, or in most cases, schools only allow a certain amount of pass-fail coursework for every semester. You pick one class pass-fail. We've been very flexible about it. And we've even allowed, if schools haven't in the past had a policy to allow pass-fail coursework, they could adopt one for just the duration of the pandemic if they chose to do so. So basically, we're okay with pass-fail. Where we drew the line was some institutions wanted to adopt a policy of providing no credit for the course. You know, do we have a no credit course? That's a problem with the very way that Title IV is administered, because we pay for credits. So there does have to be the coursework does have to entail earning. Of course, if a student fails a course, he or she doesn't receive credit. But if the course is passed, there has to be credit associated with that course. Other than that, we've been very flexible about the use of pass-fail coursework, both with brick and mortar and with online.
Yeah.
And I'd also like to add that, during the pandemic, we were really quick in the beginning to really create some regulatory flexibility for both accreditors and institutions to say, look, we know a lot of schools are going to need to pivot to distance quickly, and we didn't want to get in their way. So we created a great deal of flexibility for schools and accreditors. And, in the first 2 weeks, was all the distance education offered the best of the best? Probably not, but we think schools have responded quickly. They've continued to serve students, and they've improved. And so I'm glad we offered that flexibility, and I'm really grateful to all of the schools that use that flexibility to continue serving students. We've gotten a lot of questions about these different flexibilities. Our current guidance is that for the most part, and you can go to the OPE website and you can look up each of these individual flexibilities, but for the most part, unless otherwise directed by the CARES Act, most of the flexibilities that were provided by the Secretary under her HEROES Act authority, we have now said that those flexibilities exist until December 31st or the end of the nationally declared pandemic, whichever is later. And I think it's pretty clear that it's going to be or later. And we are now looking to see if we can even go beyond that, because we understand that the longer this lasts, the longer it's going to take for schools to pivot back to whatever normal is going to be in the future. So we don't have a final word on that, but hopefully we will soon so that we understand schools need to plan, semesters in advance. And so we're looking to see if we can expand this flexibility to give a little more time after the end of the pandemic for schools to, get prepared for whatever is next.
That reminded me, because I had read through the comment section, and for participants, if you've not done so, that's quite an endeavor because it's a voluminous set of comments. But are there any particular things in this current COVID flexibility that are going to be markedly different from what is in place when the new rules go into place that people should be aware of?
I think the only so frankly, I think Congress based a lot of the flexibilities in the CARES Act on our reg, or at least on the NPRM. I think the one thing, and I'll ask others to chime in, but the one thing I know of that's a flexibility in the CARES Act that we can't continue is because we don't have the statutory authority, and that is foreign schools. Congress gave the ability to foreign schools to participate in distance learning. That is something we think it's a great idea. We talked about it during rulemaking, fully supportive of it, but it's beyond our statutory authority. So I think that's the one place where we can't continue that when the CARES Act ends. Michael, Dave, Greg, are there other fundamental changes that?
Obviously, R2T4, you're going to have to go back to doing that again.
Right.
Well, you still have to do the calculation, but you don't have to return the funds. So, so when this is over, obviously there'll be a requirement to return the R2T4. Satisfactory academic progress requirements will kick back in again. This is just a couple. Maybe Dave has some more.
Sure. And keeping in mind that during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Secretary extended a lot of flexibility for schools to quickly turn from in-class coursework to distance education. So when the national emergency ends, schools will have to revert back to the normal process for seeking approval from their accrediting agencies before offering that kind of coursework. So that'll be one one change that won't be extended once the pandemic has ended. And then another one, there are a couple others, things like the ability, we heard that schools needed a lot of flexibility about their term lengths, how they were going to offer coursework. They wanted to extend terms or they wanted to limit terms based on, when students were going to be in class, and they wanted to make sure that students didn't go home for breaks and then come back to the campus and go home again. So we gave a lot of flexibility for academic calendars, and that will also end after the academic year when the national emergency is in effect.
So I'm going to...
And just one other thing, we have been asked about virtual site visits with accreditors. It's gone really, really well. So we're looking at, permanently permitting virtual site visits. We were, in the beginning, accreditors were like, oh, we'd never do this. And now we're hearing that once accreditors figured out how to do it, that it's working quite well, especially with low risk institutions. So look for more on that. We are looking to see if we can make that a permanent flexibility.
So I'm going to ask one closing question here. We're just about out of time. As I read through the work here, it seems to me one of the goals was to provide institutions with additional flexibility while maintaining program quality and student protections. How do you feel you've struck that balance?
I think we hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think obviously the department's starting position was more flexible than where we ended. And frankly, I mean, look, we went into rulemaking in some areas, for example, state authorization. We had heard so many complaints that we went into rulemaking having completely removed all regulations for state authorization. That doesn't mean we thought that there would be no regulation, but we really wanted to show the community, hey, we're willing to start from a clean slate. And it turned out that people said, well, we don't really need a clean slate. We just need to tweak some things. So there were places where we went into rulemaking with the proposal being, let's just get rid of it. But, we didn't really think we'd get rid of it. We just wanted a clean slate. I think we would have, we think that written arrangements done well probably could exceed 50% But negotiators didn't want to go there, and we respected the process. So I think, there are little things here and there where we gave or they gave. But I'm thrilled with the outcome. And I think we have done a really great, not we, I mean, the community, negotiators, all of us together. I think we have come out with regulations that help people understand, here's the lane I want to travel in. And we think that it provides opportunities for responsible innovation. And probably the best thing I think our regs do is acknowledge that not every experiment's going to be successful, and that we can't all agree to try something new. And then if it doesn't work, point the finger of blame at somebody else. We have to hold hands and say, you know what? This experiment seems good. We're all in agreement. Let's do it. Let's monitor it. And if it's not going well, then let's stop it. Let's not look for a scapegoat. Let's just agree. We all thought this was worthy of experimentation. And now we all agree that it didn't work so well. Yeah. And I think that's what these regs do. And yeah, I feel really proud of this work. Certainly it wasn't my work, it was the collective effort, but I am very proud of it. And I think we did a really great job.
Thank you. We've run out of time. The couple of questions that are here, we'll try to work with our colleagues for the department to see if we can get answers to those. But Diane, I want to thank you and your team for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it. And we look forward to the next time when we might get to visit in person, although I think both you and I are a little short leash on our careers, but hopefully the community will be able to meet in person soon.
Well, the election isn't certified yet, so maybe maybe we'll have in-person meetings. But if it turns out that we don't get a second term, I just want to say it's been a real joy to be back in higher ed, and I'm grateful for all of the opportunities that I've had to work with you and your members. And if we do get a second term, I will look forward to continuing our relationship. So thanks so much, really appreciate it. And thanks to my team that's on the line today.
And thanks to the rest of you for joining us. Take care.
Our pleasure.
Bye-bye.